In the days of cave drawings and hunting with bare hands, a poorly clad man chews on the end of a long stick. He has a thought, a simple thought, but one that will change the world. If I sharpen the stick, I can puncture things from far away. There has been one weapon that, transcending geography and even culture, has defined both the history of and life in the ancient and the medieval world. And contrary to common belief today, it is not the sword, the axe, or even the bow. It is the most archaic of sophisticated weaponry, the spear. The spear will be evaluated on its common usage in history, the impact it had on ancient cultures, and its adaptability and versatility. Spears were invaluable in the ancient world because they were superior in hunting over the common tool, the axe, and superior in fighting over the well-known weapon of prestige, the sword. Not only this, but spears were the easiest to make, and therefore cheapest, of the weapons of the ancient world. They had further reach than any alternative melee weapon, and so would often take the front lines of tightly packed formations, especially in the bloody interclan clashes of the Vikings. In Viking culture, the spear was the least prestigious weapon, while the axe signaled some type of authority or honor, and the right to possess a sword was the honor of only the greatest or most respected warrior, which often went hand in hand. However, the swords and axes had little strategic value compared to the spears, and Vikings clearly knew this because they kept those who wielded axes and swords at the back, and they would only fight in last resort scenarios. Graduating from one's spear meant graduating from the front lines, and greatly improved a Viking's chances of survival. While spears may not have been the weapon of honor, they were the weapon of necessity, and their effectiveness was unparalleled on the freezing Norse battlefields. Especially in Paleolithic times, the spear was unilaterally the weapon of hunting. There is debate over whether the spears were primarily thrown like javelins, used conventionally as a melee weapon, or propelled by objects called atlatls. Atlatls were throwing devices, which could be made out of wood, bone, or ivory, and had a hook on the back that would attach them to the butt of the spear. The user would throw his arm forward, launching the shaft from its place on the atlatl, and, if the user was accurate, into the hide of an unsuspecting large game animal, like a mammoth or giant sloth. Via analysis of bone fragments and hunted animals, as well as used spearheads, it can be concluded that the style of using the spear depended upon the culture, and perhaps the game they were hunting. Regardless, spears have been found to have been used worldwide as the first sophisticated hunting tool of man. Spears had a special role in cultural development as well. They functioned as status symbols in more ways than just being a spear. Spearheads were often engraved with depiction of faces. Most of the time these faces were human, likely depicting the original owner of the spear, which would be passed down through generations, from fathers to sons. Some of the higher class men had extra decorations engraved, such as showing the face of their spear wearing a helmet or a headdress. Other times the faces were not human. In fact, some were no less than the type of grotesquely evil figures that one might imagine coming out of a horror movie. Perhaps these engravings were supposed to depict spirits or gods, or they could have just been another, albeit strange, mark of high status. Spears were also almost uncontested in being the weapon of the initiation hunt. When a young male would slay an animal, and in some extreme exceptions like Spartan culture, a human, and would then be accepted with full rights into society. In Macedonian culture, a man was not allowed to recline at dinner until he had speared a boar without using a hunting net. For Athenians, it was considered dishonorable to use a bow while hunting, or any kind of snare or net. The brave hunter would face the animal head-on, wielding a spear. Physical confrontation with the animal, a meeting with danger, was essential. Again and again throughout history, spears appear as the dominant weapon of choice, shaping warfare, and through it, deciding which nations and cultures will rule the world of their times. This was because of their versatility and the ways they can be adapted to the current need. In direct contrast to Viking customs, spears were the weapons of kings in the ancient Near East. The book of 1 Samuel depicts Saul, the first king of Israel, using a spear for his scepter. Further west, spears became the primary weapon of the great hoplite formations, which was the world's first militia. These citizen soldiers kept Greece protected from the successive attacks of the gigantic Persian Empire. The use of hoplite tactics changed war forever. Now, instead of skirmishes between those of wealth and nobility and the use of hired soldiers, it became the duty of even commoners to take up arms, specifically spears, in defense of their homeland. These warriors would form tightly packed formations called phalanxes, where the front line was guarded by shields and a wall of spears protruded in front of them. The phalanx formation was revised in the Macedonian campaigns under Alexander the Great. The spears were extended to 18-foot-long sarissas, so that for every man in the front row, 5 spears would be sticking forward somewhere around him, ready to puncture any enemy of the force like a pincushion. The Romans and Chinese, who would dominate the known world after the Macedonians, each strayed from the use of the spear in their own way. The primary weapon of the Chinese became the revolutionary crossbow, while the Romans adapted the phalanx to prioritize the shield. While it wasn't a primary weapon, the Romans did use javelins as projectiles, but smaller swords became the weapon of choice, as they didn't get in the way of their clunky, human-sized shields that were necessary to protect soldiers from enemy arrows. However, with the fall of the Roman and Han empires, the spear took on a new form of usage in warfare, the lance, carried by mounted knights. The strength of a thrust did not depend on the might of a soldier's arm, but it had the weight of a horse. The final form of the spear was brought on by a return to ancient tactics by a poor and desperate group of Swiss commoners, which would soon become famous for being the deadliest warriors of the medieval era. Like the hoplite Greeks 2,000 years before, farmers from the then young nation of Switzerland fashioned pikes for themselves and recreated the impenetrable phalanx formation, laying waste to several armies of heavily armored mounted knights. It can be argued that the bow has an equal, if not more influential role in the long history of our world than the spear. Both weapons went through countless developments and adaptations right alongside one another in the timeline of weaponry, and after a time the bow even replaced the spear as the primary weapon of hunting. However, the spear had an immoral role as the weapon of the hunt of initiation for a male. Bows were the backbone of the Assyrian and Persian war machines, and the development of the crossbow under the Han dynasty changed Chinese history forever. However, the bow lacked the cultural significance of the spear. The very shape of a bow couldn't be used as a royal scepter by a king, and neither were they known to be often passed down as heirlooms such as were swords and spears. Decorating a bow could hamper its effectiveness, but spears could be brilliantly decorated with flags or engravings on the spearhead. More importantly, as far as effectiveness goes, spears had the advantage of being incredibly versatile. They could be masterfully used in tandem with a shield or a horse, while very few cultures were able to figure out the complex art that is firing a bow from horseback, and none of them even attempted to fire a bow while using a shield. It is this versatility that made the spear continue to be a valuable asset for a couple hundred years after the invention of the firearm, the very invention that extinguished the significance of the bow forever. Although the oldest among them, the spear outstrips all other weapons from primitive to medieval times in categories of usefulness in both hunting and combat, its importance in ancient culture, and its versatility. No other weapon has been as decisive in the events of the history of our world, and each and every person affected by it. Although modern depictions of ancient and medieval warfare portray a world ruled by swords and bows, the uncontested instrument of power for nearly every epoch of the human story has been the spear.